Have you ever believed that a single scrap of paper, nailed to a weather-worn gatepost, could change the course of an entire life? Folks often think fate turns on gunfire, on blood spilled, or on a storm tearing through the land. But out here on the far frontier, sometimes it's the smallest things, like a few plain words written on faded paper, that open the door to a new beginning, or drag a man deeper into the dark. If that thought stirs something in you, don't turn away. Stay with me. This isn't just a tale of dust, cattle, and gun smoke. It's the story of a heart locked up tighter than a winter cabin, a man living with silence heavier than stone. And if you've ever felt the weight of losing someone so dear that the world itself seemed to go quiet around you, I promise this story will touch something familiar inside, and maybe even light a fire you thought had gone cold. Before we ride further, if these opening words bring back a memory of your own, a porch left empty, a supper table missing laughter, tap that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from, a breezy porch out in the country, or a small room tucked away in the city. I'll promise you this by the end. You'll see that on this frontier. Bullets aren't the only things that decide a man's fate. Sometimes it's his heart. That afternoon, the New Mexico sun hung in the sky like it was nailed there, scorching everything below. The ground cracked wide and red. Dust spiraled in little devils that scratched the eyes and burned the throat. Across the pasture, cattle hugged what little shade they could find beneath spindly mesquite. And there, standing alone against the horizon, a weathered ranch house leaned into the wind, its boards bleached gray, its porch sagging, but still proud in its own way. On the steps sat Elias Ward, 35 years old, though the deep lines in his face might have passed him for more. His skin, tanned and hardened like old saddle leather, told of years under the punishing sun. But it wasn't the land that had carved the cold into his eyes. It was memory of a young wife who had braided her hair on that very porch, and who had fallen one night to a stray bullet meant for outlaws. From then on, the ranch had gone silent. No laughter, no warm bread scent drifting from the kitchen, only the creak of door hinges, the cry of coyotes, and the restless wind scratching at the eaves. Elias Ward wasn't much for talk, nor for company. He kept to himself, working cattle, mending fences, tamping out brush fires before they took root. Folks in town spoke his name in hushed tones, a man keeping to his shadows. To most, he was half legend, half ghost. He lived only to tend the land, as if the acres of dust and wire were a tombstone large enough to hold his grief. But even a man shut away from the world can't escape the simplest need, a meal worth eating. Since the day his wife was buried, Elias had lived on bitter coffee and strips of dried meat. Supper had become emptiness, a hollow that echoed through the house louder than silence. So one hot afternoon, he did something no one expected. He pulled a sheet of paper from a drawer, dipped a pen into the crust of ink left in the bottle, and scratched down a few words. Hiring ranch cook, room and board, must be decent, able and willing to stay. No flourish, no welcome, just plain lines, as blunt as the man himself. He tacked it to the gatepost with a single nail. The wind caught it at once, flapping it like a challenge. Elias stood there for a while, eyes narrowed against the sun. Truth was, he didn't expect an answer. He hadn't expected anything since the night he dug a grave behind the garden. But the frontier has a way of shifting when you least expect it. And sometimes, when a man has stopped waiting altogether, that's when fate decides to come calling. He returned to the porch, poured another swallow of black coffee into a dented tin cup. The bitter steam rose into his face as he leaned back in his chair, boots heavy on the rail. All around him, the ranch stretched wide and lonely. Wire hummed against the wind, and the hills burned purple in the distance. The place felt less like a home than a fortress built not to keep others out, but to keep himself locked in. By 1 o'clock, Elias had all but forgotten the scrap of paper shivering on the gate, until, faint and unexpected, came the crunch of footsteps on gravel. He lifted his head. Out of the shimmering heat, a figure began to take shape. Out of the shimmering heat. The figure came slowly, almost like a mirage on desert ground. But Elias Ward knew better. This was no trick of the sun. It was a woman face weathered by travel, auburn hair pinned beneath a faded bonnet, strands tugged loose by the wind. In one arm she carried a small child, head buried against her shoulder, thumb tucked into his mouth. With her free hand she guided a boy of 6, his knuckles white around the handle of a battered suitcase that seemed to hold all that was left of their world. And trailing behind came a girl, no more than 10, thin shoulders squared, dragging a sack so worn it looked as if it had already survived fire, flood, and years of hard living. Elias stopped short. He hadn't expected this, in his mind. If anyone answered that notice, it might be some rough-handed drifter, or a stout woman who'd worked chuck wagons on the trail. Not a widow, lean and unbending, standing with 3 children before his ranch gate. The woman paused at the fence line, green eyes storm-bright and unflinching as they met his. There was no plea, no fear, just a steady, near-defiant calm. Her voice, when it came, was husky, but sure you posted for a ranch cook. Elias gave a single nod, saying nothing. "I'm a cook," she went on, "and I'm a mother, and I've got no other place left to go." The wind tore through the yard then, rattling the paper tacked to the gatepost as though to prove her point. Elias studied the children, saw the hunger there, the weariness, but also something more pride, watchful and unyielding. He stood silent for a long moment, listening only to the crunch of gravel under his boots. Then, with a slow breath, he stepped aside and said, low and steady, "Come inside. We'll talk it over with coffee." The woman dipped her head once, not in weakness, not in desperation, but in acceptance. She led the children forward, through the gate, and for the first time in years, Elias Ward closed the door behind someone other than himself. Her name was Clara Whitmore. Elias learned it that evening, over supper. She offered it plain, no flourish. When he asked about her husband, she paused just long enough for silence to weigh heavy, then answered 3 years back. Shot in a border raid near El Paso. Wrong place. Wrong time. Elias pressed no further. He understood too well how sudden lead could take a life, and how grief left questions that never found answers. That very night, the house began to change. The kitchen, once filled only with the clang of iron pots, came alive with the scent of fresh bread, beans stewed with smoked pork, and cornbread light enough to crumble at the touch. Clara didn't ask where things were kept. She moved with the quiet rhythm of someone who had cooked through hardship, through grief, through years when a meal was the only anchor holding a family together. The children folded themselves into the life of the ranch with the same quiet resolve. Ruth, the eldest, swept the floor with a care beyond her age. Jonah followed Elias to the pump, hauling water without complaint. Little Caleb toddled close to his mother's skirts, wide-eyed but determined not to be left behind. They were not loud, not restless. They carried themselves like travelers who had learned obedience through scarcity, discipline through long, hard miles. And Elias, watching them, felt something he had not expected, surprise, and beneath it, admiration. He had not thought a woman like this would come knocking. He had not thought 3 weary children could make his ranch feel less like a tombstone and more like a place still breathing. That night, long after the house grew quiet, Elias sat on the porch with a cup of bitter coffee cooling in his hands. Inside, the children slept sound, and Clara mended a seam by lamplight. The silence was no longer absolute. It was no longer the kind that suffocated a man. He would not say it aloud, but in his heart he felt a measure of respect. Deep, grudging, unshakable for Clara Whitmore, the widow who dared walk through his gate with nothing but 3 children and a spine of iron. From that moment, the story was no longer his alone. In the first few days, Elias Ward's ranch seemed to take on a different breath, as if some long-forgotten heartbeat had begun to stir again. There was no ceremony to it, no announcement spoken out loud, but with Clara Whitmore and her 3 children under that roof, the silence of the place began to change its color. From early dawn until the last light drained behind the purple ridges, there were sounds soft, steady sounds that blended into a kind of music Elias hadn't heard since before death had claimed his wife, the shuffle of feet, the swish of a broom, the faint clatter of dishes, the rise and fall of a woman's voice calling children to task. Clara moved into the kitchen as though she had lived there all her life. She didn't need to ask where the salt or the cornmeal was kept. Each morning, the scent of coffee no longer burned bitter, but smooth and inviting. By midday, beans simmered with smoked pork sent their fragrance out through the open windows, promising a table that wouldn't feel empty. At night, golden cornbread and loaves of warm bread appeared, soft enough to crumble in the hand, turning a hard day's labor into something worth sitting down for. Ruth, the eldest at 10, never waited for her mother's word. At first light, when the prairie still lay under a veil of mist, Ruth was already sweeping the porch, her small hand steady on the broom. Her thin frame and serious eyes reminded Elias of the women in his own family, those who had once kept a household together against wind, drought, and grief. Jonah, just 6, found pride in the chores of the land. He trailed after Elias, watching closely how to tie a bridle, how to haul water, how to pitch hay into a restless pen. When Elias handed him a bucket heavy with water, the boy staggered, teeth gritted, but said nothing. He carried it forward, every step stiff with determination. Elias had never seen such grit in a child so young, and little Caleb, the youngest, was his mother's shadow, barefoot, dusty, wide-eyed. He clung to Clara's skirts, babbled in half-songs, and played with whatever was at hand: wooden spoons, pebbles, scraps of rope. He was no help with work, but his laughter spilled into the rooms like sunlight, and even Elias found himself smiling now and then. Evenings brought the truest change. After long hours in the saddle, Elias would sit on the porch, his body aching from the day. Through the kitchen window he could see Clara bent over the table, her hands kneading dough, her hair catching the lamp's glow. Ruth and Jonah stood nearby, listening as she guided them, while Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, tapping spoons together in his own world of play. The scene framed itself without effort, like a picture Elias thought he'd never see again. He wasn't a man who sought noise. For years, silence had been his only companion, thick, oppressive, unforgiving. Yet now, the sounds inside his house, the scrape of a chair, the patter of small feet, the low murmur of Clara's voice didn't jar him. They soothed him. They gave the silence shape and warmth instead of hollowness. At night, when the children had gone to bed, Clara sat near the fire with a lamp beside her, mending a torn shirt. Her face, thin but strong, was softened by the amber glow. Elias sometimes passed through without a word, but inside he felt a quiet respect for the woman. She asked for nothing. She didn't beg pity. She simply worked, cared for her children, and gave a house that had felt like a tomb a measure of life again. Once, Elias returned late from the pasture. Ruth was waiting at the door with a small lantern held high, her eyes shining in the light. For a brief moment, as he stepped into the glow, Elias realized the ranch no longer felt like a fortress built against the world. It was beginning to feel like a home. The change was not loud. It didn't come with grand gestures or bold declarations. It crept in like a cool breeze slipping through the slats on a hot day, subtle, gentle, but impossible to ignore. And Elias, who had sworn himself to solitude, found himself unsettled not by grief, but by peace, by warmth, by a belonging he hadn't dared to imagine. Day after day, Clara and the children wove themselves into the ranch until Elias could scarcely remember what the place had been like without them. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone felt it. Something new had settled in the dust and timber of that house, a warmth that lived in meals shared, in children's footsteps, in the quiet presence of a woman who carried herself with quiet strength. And in that warmth, even the hard land of New Mexico seemed to soften. Out of wind and silence, a fragile seed of peace had begun to grow. The warmth that had settled over Elias Ward's ranch lasted only a few weeks before the whispers from town began to creep in. Out on the frontier, news didn't need newspapers or telegraphs. It spread by curious eyes and wagging tongues. And so, one morning, as Elias tied his horse outside the general store, he heard voices drifting from behind a barrel of flour. Ward brought a woman out to his ranch, her and 3 kids. Not kin, not married. Living like that. Well, you know what it means. The words were cut short, but Elias caught them all. He didn't turn his head. He'd grown used to being talked about, but this time something twisted inside him, not for his own name, but for Clara's, and for the children. By the time Clara walked into town with Ruth to buy needles and cloth, the looks were sharper. Some folks averted their gaze, others stared bold, judgment plain on their faces. Clara said nothing, her chin held high as she passed through the gauntlet of eyes. Ruth clung to her hand, squeezing until her knuckles whitened. They had just stepped to the dry goods store when a man lounged against the saloon rail across the street, a matchstick rolling between yellowed teeth. His smile was slow, mean, his eyes fixed on Clara. "Women like you don't belong out here," he muttered loud enough for all to hear. "Raising young'uns with a man like Ward. Don't folks remember he's got blood on his hands?" Clara walked on, not slowing. But when the man reached to grab her wrist, the air seemed to freeze. A shadow fell between them. Elias. He hadn't made a sound, but suddenly he was there, tall and unmovable. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just looked at the man with eyes hard as iron. His hand drifted slowly, deliberately, to rest on the worn leather of his gun belt. "She's here to buy thread," Elias said, his voice quiet but sharp enough to split timber. "You planning to stop that?" The silence spread, pressing heavy on everyone within earshot. People paused mid-step. The man swallowed, bluff, faltering. But he tried to hold his ground. Didn't mean nothing. "Ward, just talkin', then talk less." The street held its breath. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man eased back, step by step, before slipping through the saloon doors, leaving behind tension that hung like a rope just snapped. Clara stood beside Elias, still and silent. She didn't thank him. She didn't have to. Her eyes flickered toward him, hard to read, a mix of caution and something unspoken. But Ruth's gaze lingered on Elias, wide and steady, the look of a child who knew she'd just been shielded. By that evening, the story had circled the town, in the blacksmith's shop, at the cafe, on the church steps. The whispers grew. Ward stood up for that widow, bold, doing it in broad daylight, in front of half the town. Maybe he doesn't care what anyone says anymore. The fragile peace of the ranch now had to stand against a tide rolling in from outside. Elias heard it all, knew it all, but offered no explanations. He simply kept to his work. Yet inside himself he made a promise anyone who tried to shame Clara or her children would have to go through him first. That night, with the ranch quiet and the children asleep, Elias sat alone on the porch, listening to crickets scratch at the dark. He knew the gossip would linger, maybe even swell. But beneath the noise, he felt something rare certainty. He had stood once, and he would stand again. Because sometimes, a house only becomes a home when there's someone willing to plant themselves between it and the storm outside. That night, after the storm of gossip from town, the ranch sank into a different kind of silence. Not the hollow quiet that had haunted Elias Ward for years, but the hush of people sharing the same roof after a long day's work. The lamplight threw soft, flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Outside, crickets rasped in the grass, blending with the steady breathing of children asleep in the small back room. Elias sat on the porch, a tin cup in his hand gone cold long ago. His face was tight, his eyes fixed on the black stretch of land. Behind him came the faint creak of a door. Clara stepped out, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She lowered herself onto the steps, leaving just enough space between them to keep things proper. She didn't speak at first, only gazed out toward the corral where the horses stood like shadows under the stars. For a time, there was only the wind. Then Elias spoke, his voice slow, every word dragging weight behind it. "My wife's name was May," he said, eyes still on the dark horizon. "She had a way of arguing with me about near everything: fence posts, feed schedules, even how to set the bread to rise. Truth is, I think it was that stubborn streak that kept this place alive." Clara stayed quiet, waiting. Elias drew a slow breath. "We never had children. Tried more than once. Lost both before they ever saw the light of day. After the last one, May grew quiet. Too quiet. Then one night, gunfire broke out in the yard. She stepped into the doorway like it didn't matter anymore if a bullet found her. And one did. I didn't get to her in time." He stopped, jaw clenched, breath held against the ache that never quite left. The sound of crickets seemed louder. He turned the cup in his hand, staring at the blackness. Clara folded her hands in her lap, smoothing the edge of her shawl. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, even. "My husband was Whitmore. Not a cruel man, just a fearful one, afraid of failing, afraid of silence, sometimes afraid of his own children. He drank too much, but he still kept food on the table. Then the border war called him up. He ran. They caught him, shot him not a mile from camp. Her breath caught, but she pressed on. His family blamed me, said a proper wife would have stopped him. They told me to leave, 3 mouths to feed, nowhere to go. I took any work I could: washing, scrubbing, cooking for a saloon. Didn't matter that I wasn't one of the girls. Rumors travel faster than truth. I kept my head down, saved what I could." Clara's eyes lifted toward the lamplight, glimmering, but lined with years of fatigue. Then came the fire. A fight. A lamp tipped. The whole back of the place went up. I nearly lost Ruth behind a jammed door. We walked away with nothing but the clothes on our backs and that ragged sack you've seen. That's when I found your notice on the gate, and I prayed you wouldn't ask too many questions." Elias turned to her then. There were no tears in her eyes, only a dry resilience, like riverbed stone. Slowly, he set down his cup, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a folded handkerchief, the fabric worn thin, the stitching pale blue along the edge. He held it out. "May's," he said softly. "She would have liked you." Clara stared at it for a long moment, as if it might break in her hands. At last, she took it gently, wordless. They sat there in quiet, saying nothing more. Between them, the silence was no longer empty. It was an understanding that didn't need explaining that both had been marked by losses unseen, yet somehow kept moving forward. High above, a single star split the night, leaving a quick scar of light. Neither of them wished upon it. They knew sometimes what people need isn't magic, but someone beside them, steady and silent, who understands. That night, Elias Ward and Clara Whitmore did not become lovers, nor did they make vows. But in their quiet sharing, a foundation was laid not of wood or stone, but of trust, the fragile kind that grows when two battered hearts recognize themselves in each other and find, against all odds, they are not alone. The sky changed faster than anyone could reckon. What began as a calm afternoon turned heavy and mean when black clouds rolled in from the west, thick as a blanket dropped across the valley. Thunder cracked like cannon fire, and the cattle scattered in panic. Clara stood on the porch, clutching Caleb tight against her chest, her eyes fixed on the pasture where Elias had already spurred his horse toward the barn. "This one's bad," Clara said, her voice low but steady. Elias only nodded, gaze locked on the horses already screaming and pounding inside the storm-dark barn. "I need to check the beams. If the wind hits from the west, they won't hold." He didn't wait for her to answer. He threw on an oilskin coat, jerked the reins, and vanished into the rain. Inside the barn, chaos reigned. Wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Rain drummed against the roof, and the horses kicked and reared, eyes rolling white with fear. Elias shoved the doors shut against the gale just as a sound split the noise, a high, terrified cry. Jonah. His heart seized. In a flash of lightning, Elias saw the boy crouched behind a half-collapsed trough, soaked through, hands covering his head. He must have followed, thinking to help, and gotten trapped in the storm's fury. "Easy, son." Elias growled through the roar, plunging forward. But fate didn't give him time. A sharp crack ripped through the rafters as the oldest beam gave way. The timber came down hard, and in that instant Elias didn't think he only threw himself over the boy, wrapping Jonah in his arms. The blow hit like a hammer. The beam slammed across his shoulder, pinning him half to the ground. Pain flared hot, sharp enough to steal his breath, but Elias held tight. Jonah sobbed into his chest, small fists beating at him in panic. Elias ground the words out between clenched teeth. "You all right?" The boy nodded through tears. With a grunt, Elias braced what strength he had left, back and legs straining. He heaved once, twice, 3 times before the timber shifted just enough. He dragged Jonah out from under it, staggering toward the door as the storm tore the world apart when they stumbled into the open. Clara was already running barefoot through the mud, hair plastered to her face, shawl clinging heavy with rain. She dropped to her knees, gathering Jonah against her, kissing his wet cheeks, whispering, "My boy, my sweet boy." Then her eyes lifted and found Elias. His right arm hung useless, blood mixing with mud down his sleeve. His face was pale, jaw locked tight against the pain. "You're hurt," Clara gasped. Elias shrugged with his good shoulder, his voice rough. "Nothing I haven't earned." But his legs gave way, and Clara caught him as he sagged. Her hands trembled, yet she held him steady. In the downpour, her gaze met his, not cautious, not distant, but filled with something deeper: respect. Word of what happened spread faster than the storm itself. By morning, neighbors rode out to the ranch with excuses of checking fences or helping patch the barn. But every eye turned toward Elias's arm, bound in a sling, and to Jonah, who clung to him as though to his own father. The whispers had changed their tune. He didn't leave that boy behind. Took the hit himself to save him. Maybe we've been wrong about Ward. For the first time in years, Elias's name was spoken with something like respect, and for Clara, that night marked a turning. Trust was not born from promises or polite words. It was born when a man threw himself under falling timbers to keep her son alive. From then on, The wall around her heart began to crack. The storm had passed, but Elias Ward's wounds were hardly healed when another storm gathered, this one not from the sky, but from Clara's past. It was a blistering noon when dust rose on the trail leading to the ranch. Out of the heat came a lone rider, his long coat flaring, his seat in the saddle carrying the arrogance of a man who believed the land itself bent to him. When he reined in at the gate, Clara was on the porch, Ruth clutching at her skirts, eyes wide with dread. The man tipped his hat, a crooked smile twisting his mouth. "Didn't expect you to land on your feet so fast." "Clara." Clara's face drained of color. Her voice cracked. Almost a whisper. "Marcus Hale." Elias stepped out from the yard, putting himself between them. His eyes darkened. "You know this man?" Marcus thumped his chest, grinning. "Know me, I'm her husband. And those children mine." The air turned heavy. Clara steadied herself, her voice trembling but firm. "No, you are not. Whitmore was my husband. He's dead. You," her eyes narrowed. "You're nothing but a liar." Marcus shrugged. Smile like a knife. "No papers of death. No decree. As far as the law's concerned, she's still mine. And this land, maybe it ought to be mine too." The words cut like a whip crack. Elias didn't move, but his hand brushed the strap of his holster. His voice came low and hard. "Then prove it." The news spread like wildfire. By sundown, the whole town was buzzing the widow Clara, now accused of never being widowed at all. Her children branded as illegitimate. Elias Ward said to be harboring a deceiver. Whispers sharpened into stares, and stares turned to cold words thrown openly as Clara walked through the market. One morning, 3 women cornered her outside the mercantile. "You've shamed this town with lies, living like a wife without a wedding. And now your husband's returned. What will you say to that?" Ruth clung to her mother, eyes fierce, fists balled. Clara drew a long breath, refusing to cry. "I buried my husband 3 years ago, in my heart and in memory. The man who stands here now only twists the truth to his advantage." Her voice carried, steady but heavy with unshed tears. Elias knew words would never be enough. He rode hard to the parson's house, pounding the door with a bruised fist. When the reverend opened, Elias wasted no time. "I need church records. Marcus Hale, Whitmore. Anything to prove the truth." The reverend hesitated. "Ward, this is a delicate matter." Elias stepped closer, eyes burning steady. "Clara has nothing left to lose. I'll not let a lie steal what little she's built." That night, under the lamplight, the reverend handed him a thin letter from the county register. The truth was plain. Whitmore had fallen in a skirmish, buried under another name. Marcus Hale was his brother, no husband at all. Just a man exploiting confusion for gain. The next day, Elias walked into the saloon where Marcus was holding court over a game of cards. The room stilled the moment he stepped inside. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw his gun. He simply stood in the center of the floor, his words loud enough for every ear. "You lied to this town. You called a widow a fraud. You tried to steal her name and her home. But here's the truth, you were never her husband. Not once." Marcus smirked. But when Elias raised the paper for all to see, the smirk faltered. Around the room, eyes turned hard. Elias let his hand rest near his belt buckle, not pulling, not threatening, just reminding. "You can leave on your feet," Elias said evenly. "Or I'll drag you out by the stirrups." The silence was like a blade drawn tight. Marcus's laugh cracked, thin and hollow. Then he backed away, step by step, before slinking through the doors into the street, leaving only the bitter taste of defeat behind him. That evening, Elias returned to the ranch. Clara sat on the porch steps, weary but lifted when she saw him. Ruth and Jonah watched from the doorway. Elias didn't tell the tale in detail. He simply nodded once. He won't be coming back. Clara exhaled, the relief plain, as though laying down a burden she'd carried too many years. Elias sat beside her, not touching, not speaking more. But they both knew this time he had defended more than her roof. He had defended her honor before the whole town. And from that day on, the name Elias Ward carried not only the weight of solitude, but the respect due a man of honesty and courage, one who would stand against the storm of lies to shield a widow and her children. The town didn't change overnight, but truth has a way of seeping in like wind through a canyon. Slow, steady, unstoppable. After Marcus Hale was exposed and rode out for good, the eyes of the townsfolk turned softer. Gone were the sharp whispers and sideways glances when Clara passed through the market. In their place came small nods, tentative smiles, and greetings spoken with awkward sincerity. An old widow at the edge of town sent Ruth home with an apple pie, wordless but warm. The blacksmith dropped off fresh lumber for the barn without asking for payment. Even the reverend, who had once hesitated to hand over the letter that cleared Clara's name, rode out himself to the ranch. Shaking Elias's hand with quiet conviction, these weren't grand gestures, but together they built a bridge of trust Clara had thought would never stand again. At the ranch, the bond between Elias and Clara's family deepened with every sunrise. Elias's arm was still healing, so Ruth and Jonah shouldered heavier chores. Clara tended the garden, kept the kitchen alive with smells of bread and stew, and chased after little Caleb when he darted between fence posts. In the evenings, when children's laughter echoed off the porch, Elias found himself listening in stillness, as though hearing music he thought was lost forever. Clara, bent over her sewing by lamplight, sometimes caught his gaze. No words were needed. That quiet presence between them said more than talk ever could. When autumn came, Elias made a decision that surprised everyone. He would host a gathering at the ranch. He sent word to the town, borrowed chairs from the church, asked neighbors to bring pies, and invited an old fiddler to play. No one refused. In fact, the town welcomed the chance, as though they had been waiting for a way to set things right. On the evening of the feast, lanterns swung from fence posts, glowing warm against the cool dusk. Long tables stretched across the yard, laid with roasted meat, potatoes, bread, and hot coffee. The fiddle struck up a lively tune, laughter spilled into the night air, and children raced through the grass in their Sunday best. Ruth tied ribbons to the porch rail. Jonah wore a clean shirt Clara had mended, and Caleb ran wild with jam on his cheeks. Squealing with joy, Clara moved among them in a simple blue dress, auburn hair pinned loose at her neck, a smile lighting her face. It wasn't the guarded smile Elias had seen before, but one full and free, the kind that belonged to a woman no longer carrying the weight of shame. He watched her pour coffee and slice pies, her laughter mingling with the music, and thought to himself he had never seen anything more beautiful. As the sun sank behind the hills and twilight painted the sky in red and gold, Elias stepped out into the yard. The fiddle fell silent. Conversation stilled. He stood there for a long moment, then turned toward Clara. He didn't kneel. He didn't hold out a ring. Instead, he sat down on the bench beside her, folded his hands, and spoke in the plain way he always had. Mrs. Whitmore, if you ever thought about cooking for someone for the rest of your life, I'd be proud if that someone was me. Laughter rippled gentle through the crowd. Clara blinked, caught off guard. Then her smile broke wide and open. She didn't answer with words. She simply reached over and took his hand. Applause rolled across the yard. The fiddle sprang back to life, and the ranch filled with voices of celebration. The next morning, with dawn just breaking, and mist still clinging to the grass. 5 riders set out from the ranch. Elias in front, Clara at his side, Ruth, Jonah, and Caleb trailing behind. Their shadows stretched long across the golden earth. 5 figures bound together not by blood, but by choice. They rode steady into the sunrise, not speaking, because they didn't have to. The picture said it all. A family, remade from sorrow, stitched together by love and stubborn will. They had survived storms of wind and storms of rumor. They had borne grief, endured lies, and carried scars. Yet here they were, whole and riding forward. And if you've come this far with their story, maybe you felt it too. The power of broken people finding each other. The quiet miracle of love taking root where despair once lived. That's the gift of Elias Ward, a man who shut his heart for years, only to open it again to a widow and her children. That's the strength of Clara Whitmore, a woman who stood tall through shame and fire, now stepping freely into joy. If you believe stories of rebirth like theirs deserve to be told, then stay with us. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a word of encouragement in the comments, and tell us what you'd like to see for Elias and Clara's next chapter. Should they expand the ranch, raise more cattle, or face new trials together as a family? Your voice helps guide where their trail leads next. Because out here in the West, love and courage don't end with one story. They only open the gate to another beginning under a sky wide enough to hold both sorrow and hope.